So now up to this point, we've figured out how to divide our render into a number of layers with foreground, midground, background, and a hero layer where something goes from the midground behind the foreground into an area in front of the foreground. And we can render all of those things out. I've changed my naming strategy a little bit. I didn't do a folder within a folder. It made my rendering a little too deeply nested in a folder structure. So you can name it by scene, underscore render layer, whatever. Now, the one thing that you can't seemingly do right now, unless I'm missing it, is to name your render according to the AOV that you export. So right now, rendering according to the layer name is good. So you'll get renders called Compositing example 2 underscore the name of the layer. So if I switch to the foreground layer, you'll get this sort of naming strategy, which is exactly what we want. So we can see what we're dealing with. However, now we want to look at adding some AOVs. So these are arbitrary output values, and there's no clear way, at least that I can see, to name your renders according to the AOVs. Now, they should be put into a separate folder, but when you bring them into After Effects, they'll share the name of the render layer that they're rendered from. You'll see what I mean when we do the renders. So just be warned. So now let's go to AOVs. And like we saw earlier, these are things that you can add to your render to divide your render into useful layers, in a sense, or well, not layers, but useful render information. So if you want to render out just the diffuse colors on their own, you can add this as an AOV, and you will get this as a separate render. Now, I say as a separate render because if we look back in the Common tab here, under the file name, there is an option to merge AOVs. And if you're rendering as an EXR, you can have all your AOVs merged into the same file or stack of files as your just regular render, your RGB render. And then you can extract those using tools in After Effects or whatever compositing tool that you're using. I'm not going to merge AOVs. So what this means is we'll get a render for our layer here, just the RGB value, just the actual representation of the image. And then whatever AOVs we choose, we'll get separate EXR renders for those. Okay, so depends what you want to do. If you merge the AOVs, there'll be a lot more information in just one file, but you'll have to extract that. It may make it a little more efficient for your file storage, but for now, let's just leave it as is. So the only one we're going to look at right now is the Zdepth. Another interesting thing to look at, but you need a plugin, at least in After Effects, to use this. We'll come back to this later, are these crypto AOVs, particularly these last two here. These will make flat colors that represent all the different objects in your scene or all the different materials used in your scene. And you can use these AOVs to make selection masks, so you can affect only those things. So we'll come back to this and look at it in another video, but for now, let's just look at the Zdepth or Zdepth. So we're going to add this, and you can see it adds an AOV here. And by default, it will add it to every render layer. So you'll get a background layer, Zdepth, you'll get a midground layer, Zdepth, and so on. The way we're working, though, we don't really want a Zdepth for each of these layers. We want one for kind of the master layer, everything in the scene. So we could, if we have all of these set to renderable, and we're also going to render the master layer, we could use the master layer to generate our Zdepth. So if we wanted to turn off Zdepth for each of these other layers, we could add an override on the visible layer to turn that off. Or maybe it makes more sense to turn it off as the default and add an override for the visible layer to turn it on. Now you see you can't do overrides on the master layer. So what we're going to have to do is make sort of our own master layer to do this. Let's just turn this back on. So we'll create a new layer and we'll call this master for Zdepth. Okay, and we're just going to add everything into this collection here. So we'll do this, we'll call this everything, or so master for Zdepth all. We're going to add everything here. And so just the things that we need to see. Repro mesh. I've turned off those floaty particles just to simplify things a little bit. I think that's everything. So now if we look at this layer, it should look just like our regular layer. And if I do a render here, just to check, yeah, it looks the way we want it to look. So now if we go back to our AOVs, go back to our master layer, and let's just turn it off. So that AOV is off for all layers. Then we'll go to our newly created layer, turn that on as the visible layer, and we can create an override for this now, and just turn Zdepth on for this layer. So now it's off for the master, it's off for the background layer, and so on. And it is only turned on for this master for Zdepth. So you can see it brought down this other tab for AOVs, for Z, absolute override enabled. Okay? So the other thing that we want to do here is to maybe change the material on all the objects here. And the reason for this is when it renders this out, it's going to render out the Z depth, and we'll see that in a minute. But it'll also just render out the normal render here, the RGB values. So we're going to get this too. And, you know, there are reflections and, you know, things like that. And so it'll take a little while to render, but we don't really need that information because we're generating all of that stuff in these other layers. So I'm going to do a material override on this layer, on this collection. So right click, do a material override, and I'm going to override the, sorry, I'm off screen here. So I did a material override. I'm going to override the material with something simple, not even an Arnold shader. I'll just use a Maya surface shader. So a surface shader is one that just returns whatever color you have in here. It ignores lights, it ignores everything. And so it just renders really quickly. And since we don't really care about the RGB render layer here, we just want it to render quickly so we can get the Zdepth pass. This is one way to kind of simplify that. Okay, so let's just do a test render here. Okay. So if I render this layer now, it should just be all black. And if I look at my Zdepth pass, I don't see anything, but if I adjust the exposure, we can start to see what we expect to see here. So here's -10 exposure, and we're going to change this when we get to After Effects too. But you can see it's giving us information about how distant an object is from the camera based on its level from white to black. Now, once we get into After Effects, we'll make those things closest to the camera white or close to white, and things farther away from the camera tending towards black. Yeah, we won't see it here, so this is just working in the negative. It's too far. So I hope you get the idea what we're going to get out from this. So we're going to set this up to render now. So I haven't rendered any of this yet. And we will turn off renderability for the master layer because we don't need that. And the last thing I'll do is I changed my frame rate in between videos, or sorry, my end frame. So I'll just change that. It should still be set up in the master layer at 90, and in things like the background layer, yeah, there's an override to 1. So I'll set up this render and let it go, and we'll come back and take a look at what we see. So just go into to rendering, render. I don't have the Arnold license installed here, so I'm going to do a render sequence, camera 1, all render enabled layers. I only have one camera, and this should all be good. I'm doing it a pretty low quality render, so it will render quickly. So if I click on this, and then just slightly off screen, the render will start. Okay, so I'll see you when we get back. Okay, so the render's done, and now we're back in After Effects here. Let me just get my window where it needs to be. And we'll import and recreate the file. So just going to double click in the project window and compositing renders. So we did 2 passes, or there's only one AOV, so we have a Z folder here. We've got a beauty folder here that's going to have all of our render layers. So there's the background layer. You see it's just 1 frame, so we can import that. And then foreground layer, that is all 90 frames, so OpenEXR sequence should be checked. Bring that in. And then we'll scroll down here. And so there's our hero layer. Again, OpenEXR sequence. Now we should have our midground layer. It should just be 1 frame here. Import. Now, if I double click in here, we also have our master for Zdepth. And this is just the black render. So we don't need that. And we're not going to bother bringing it in. Instead, we'll go back to the renders folder and go into the Zdepth. And here we see master for Zdepth. And this one is the one we want because it contains that depth information. All right. So let's put this together. So let's take the foreground layer because it's 90 frames. We'll just drag it onto the new comp button. And let's bring the midground layer in, which of course should not be sitting in front of this one. So we'll just drag it underneath in the timeline. Bring in the background layer, same thing here. And finally the hero layer, which is going to sit on top. Okay, we don't see it yet because it's hidden, but if we play the animation, there it is, and the composition, the matte cutout works just fine, and everything comes back together in the end. I just noticed one thing I didn't do actually. In the midground layer, I didn't include the background as an object to cast light on it. That's why it looks a little drab, because it's not receiving the light from the background like this one is. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. Could always fix that just by re-rendering this one layer and making that adjustment, which is one of the benefits of working in layers. Okay, so now we want to work with our Zdepth layer here. I think the thing that we should do is to make a pre-comp. So this is the composition that we just made. So I'm going to rename this. So right click on it here in the project folder, and I'll just call this comp whatever the scene name is. And I'm going to call it pre-depth. Okay. And I'm going to drag this. So this, what we're seeing down here in the timeline, is the contents of this. So, but I'm going to drag this into its own composition. So now we've got a nested comp. And this new one that I've just created, I'm going to rename it and call it with depth. Okay. And so into this new comp, the one with depth here, we're going to drag our Zdepth layer, and it'll just look like this because we haven't revealed the information yet. Now, we were rendering these things out at a 32-bit depth in Maya, so we have to make sure for this to work under File, Project Settings, and After Effects, under Color, that we have the depth set to 32 bits per channel. Otherwise, the default, I think, is 8 bits per channel, but if you have that, it won't be able to read the EXR file and extract the depth information. Okay. So the next thing we want to do is right-click on the depth layer. Sorry, this is going off screen, so I'll do it up here. So I'll just click on the depth layer and go to Effect, 3D Channel, and we want to use Extractor. Okay. So extractor is a way to extract information from EXRs. That's why the E, X, and R are capitalized here. And you can see that it turns black, so it's trying to read something from here. And to change what it's reading, we have to click on this area here, one of these letters, R, G, or B, and it should open this channel, or this dialog box. We want to set all layers to Y. Now, it doesn't always work, so you usually have to go through and set each one to Y. Don't worry about the alpha channel, and just say OK. It turns white again. And now we just have to adjust the black point and the white point till we start seeing the image. Right, so I've just gone up here to about 30, and we want to see as much definition as we can. And then the white point, we can adjust that to maybe a negative value. Just have to keep working with this till we get, oops, what we want here. So I want to see the midground object a little bit. So this is pretty good. So my values for this are 60, black point, white point is 11. Now, whether these numbers will be different from scene to scene based on the scale of the scene, plenty of other things. But now we can use this to drive how blur is applied to our scene. So we're going to use this as a matte. Now we're not going to use it as track matte. We're actually going to use it as a blur map in one of the blur options here. So with the composition selected, and we can even hide the blur layer. So we've got the composition selected that contains all this information. And we're going to go to Effect, and I'm going to show this twice. Once with the built-in camera lens blur in After Effects. So under Effect, Blur, Sharpen, camera lens blur. And then I'll show it using Frischluft, which is an effect that you can buy from a company called Frischluft or Lenscare. No, the effect is called Lenscare. Frischluft is the company. So you can see everything is blurred out. And the blur radius here, this is in the camera lens blur, is going to determine how blurry it is. So as I turn this up, it gets more and more blurry, but it gets blurry to the same degree everywhere. But if we go down here a little further, we can go to Blur Map Layer, and we can choose the depth layer. Now you can see it didn't do anything because it's set only to use the source image. We have to change this so it uses the effects we put on it, in this case the extractor. And now you can see that this is not blurred and this is blurred, so it's using the map to place this. And we can now change the blur focal distance. We can just scrub over this number and bring the foreground into focus and put this out of focus. So this works pretty well, and we can turn on repeat edge pixels. You see this sort of vignetting around the edge. That's because it's sampling off screen for the blur. So we just turn on repeat edge pixels to get rid of that effect. Now this works pretty well, and you can change the blur focal distance to put the background elements in focus and the midground elements in focus. So now if I just scrub along so we can see our hero cell. So it's in front of the midground, the thing that's in focus right now, and so it's blurred out too. And here we're starting to see one of the limitations with the camera lens blur. I don't think there's anything to change here that will fix this. Whoops. So if we just zoom into this a little bit, you can start to see one of the problems. So that blurs this nicely, but when there's a strong drop off between blur regions, so this is the depth map here, when it goes from this, light gray to a darker gray, it says blur a lot here and blur a lot less here, and we get this sort of edging happening here. There's also a problem with anti-aliasing. Here on the edges, you can see that the Zdepth map is not anti-aliased, so you get this sort of harsh fall off. So there are ways you could probably solve that with rendering at double the size and then shrinking it down to get softer edges here, but it's not going to totally solve it. We can reduce the blur amount a little bit to try and get rid of that a bit, but it's not a great solution. If I change the focal distance back up to 1, it works a little better here where the background is out of focus and the foreground is in focus. Here we can see some of that haloing going on here too. And you see it here as well, where there's a big drop off and blur between here and here. We can see it more if I really turn up the value. You can see this sharp edge that appears in the blur. However, if you want to do something subtle, then it can work pretty well. So something like this, you can get this feeling of blurriness in the background, and you can animate it to do sort of a fake rack focus from the foreground to the background. So we could animate this blur if I just stop that right now. So let's say we wanted to all of a sudden focus on this thing. We could set a key on blur focal distance. And a few frames later, we can try and get that blue cell into focus. So something like that. So it's doing a focal shift. So I'll just hit U on the keyboard to show the keyframes I have on this layer. And then maybe as it comes forward again, we want to try and focus on this. I don't know. And it will set another keyframe for us. And we can just preview this. So it comes in, we shift our focus, oh, what's this thing? And then we try and pull our focus to follow it as it comes into the foreground. So you can do a little focal shift like that, or focus shift like that. So it can work pretty well if you can live with these kind of limitations in this vignetting and haloing around things. However, if you want to use 2D depth of field frequently in your production, it would probably be worthwhile purchasing Frischluft, and which I have it here. So we'll do the same thing here. So I'm just turning off the camera lens blur. So it's not having any effect right now. And on the comp with our renders in it, we'll go to Effect, Frischluft, Depth of Field. And we can turn up the blur here, and it does the same sort of thing. The other thing I didn't mention before is that one of the good things about the camera lens blur and Frischluft is it tries to simulate real camera lens blur by when something is bright and very out of focus, it assumes the shape of the camera aperture. So the camera lens blur is set to be hexagon shaped, giving you that kind of bokeh feel. Here in Frischluft depth of field, we can change the iris to have as many facets as we want. So right now it's triangular. I can change it 6 to be hexagonal, and it's kind of hard to see, but if it gets really blurred, these highlights, for example, start to assume that hexagonal shape. So just like before, we have to add a depth layer. And again, just like before, we have to say don't just use the source, but use the mask and effects. And this has a bit of a better way of placing your focus. So you can change the focal point by adjusting the levels of gray here. So from 255, so you can push from the foreground to the background like this. And you can see there's still some issues with the foreground to background, but it's handling it much better. I don't know what it does, but it deals with these edges of the depth map in a way that is more acceptable. But you can also select depth here with this pointer. It gets a little laggy sometimes when you do this, but if I click on here, then it will just put in the right value to put this into focus. And if I want to just drag this around, it will keep updating what's in focus. So here I can put this sort of trabecula into focus and then jump to this one. Our focus will pop like that. So we can do the same sort of thing. We can maybe have this part in focus, and we can set a key on the focal point. And then as the cell appears, maybe we'll just put another key here, and then can try and pop over to the, oops. Where's my select depth? There it is. So I can move this over here. And you can see it's doing a much better job here between those two things. And then as this comes up here, we can try and follow it. And then maybe as it goes off screen, our focus pops to the cells here again. So let's just play that through. So it's slightly out of focus. That comes in, we follow it. So there's that little wavering focal shift that it's much easier to experiment here in 2D than it is to put the depth of field in 3D, although the quality is not as good as true depth of field that you would get out of Maya with Arnold, but this can work pretty well. And you can always go in and change the amount of blur. Now, if you do it too much, you'll start to see the artifacting a little more obviously. But you can play around with that. So it adds some nice imperfection to the camera work that makes it kind of seem a more believable scene, as if it's being photographed rather than just rendered. Anyway, I hope you find this helpful, adding Zdepth. In the next video, we'll look at using Cryptomat to do an ID pass as a maybe even more efficient way to use render layers and AOVs instead of render layers. Okay, thanks.